What are founders? I'm starting off with a contentious definition here. A founder is not just an originator of an idea, but also the ones who have put in significant work in identifying an opportunity to exploit, investigating market appetite, and validating a product that serves market needs. If you come up with an idea, but then abandon it without executing, you are not a founder. I wanted to give a little bit of my personal opinion about founders versus quote-unquote founders. I know a lot of first-time founders have a little bit of anxiety when it comes to working with their co-founders or building their initial founding team. A lot of times, people, rightfully so, are a little bit apprehensive about, just like in high school, someone working on a group project, maybe they are the one who came up with the idea, but they really don't put in any of the work. And when it comes to startups and, the legal ramifications of things, someone can claim the title of founder and take a portion of equity in a startup, even though they didn't work on anything. And that's unfortunately the reality, and I don't think it's right. Personally, as I've stated in my definition of who an actual founder is, it's someone who has actually taken the initiative to go out, strike out, start a project, and then see it through into being actually a legitimate business. That's what we're supposed to be doing as founders of startups, of businesses. And so ultimately, I don't really like the notion of someone creating an idea, recruiting a team, but then not doing anything, abandoning it, but then coming back after seeing the hard work that someone else has done to say, oh my gosh, I came up with the idea of it. I deserve this. I deserve that. Well, in my opinion, you really haven't earned it unless you've seen it the full way through. But ultimately, unfortunately, there are cases where people have taken equity for a portion of the work being done, and ultimately that results in dead equity, which is a major red flag for investors when there is someone who owns a portion of a company but is no longer working there and not really contributing anything. It just doesn't really look great. And so really something that you have to be diligent about. It's two sides of the coin when it comes to team formations and thinking about early startup positions, like who is going to be actually good, solid, contributing members on a founding team. There are legal ways, and we can discuss this in a future episode, about how you can protect your startup and make it fair between different team members, related to the portion of equity being given, to clauses in a contractual agreement that you can sign between founders, and have agreements set up that people need to be contributing up to a certain period of time or a certain amount of effort that has been agreed upon, all that type of stuff. But ultimately, let's go and talk about the next part, right, which isn't just, how much effort people have gone in, how much work they've done, but also what people can actually contribute based off of their skill set. So let's talk about the individual positions in a startup, and we'll start right off with the top of the ship, the CEO. There needs to be one person in charge of any startup. I don't care even if the equity is split 50-50. Someone needs to have 51% say. Because to have multiple leaders means there are no leaders. And it becomes ever more cancerous over time when you have squabbling co-founders who have co-equal power, and eventually there comes to a butting of heads. There always is at some point in the future, and there's no tiebreaker. It's an awful situation. It destroys companies. Interpersonal conflicts within teams is one of the largest reasons why startups fail. And so, in order to alleviate that, we start with the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO, who has overall control of the business. Caveat with some future positions in the future that will be over them, but at least at the start, the CEO, the buck stops here. They are in charge. And to speak specifics, they are the highest ranking executive responsible for the overall direction, strategy, and success from when you are first starting out with a project and attempting to validate it into a young company. Their role often overlaps with other functions due to the limited amount of resources that an early stage startup has to deal with. Everyone kind of has to do everything, and in a fast-paced growth environment, you might be doing one thing one day and another thing the next day, with the CEO needing to oversee and sometimes personally be involved with everything. Let's break down what a CEO's primary roles and responsibilities are. Starting with vision and strategy. That's something that the CEO will probably be doing throughout the rest of the lifetime of the business. They need to define the company's vision and mission, establishing the long-term direction and purpose of the business. Ultimately, they're the one who has to come up with strategic goals, with some roles that we'll discuss in the future being the board of directors, and primary shareholders. They need to create a roadmap with their C-suite team, anyone who has a chief title, in order to achieve product market fit, scale sustainably, and ultimately compete. When there are problems, and there will be problems in a startup, they need to adapt and pivot when necessary. They need to monitor and understand feedback from their market participants, their customers, and users, and adjust their strategy quickly when they're needed. The earlier the company, the faster they got to move. The primary strength of a startup is the speed in which you can attack things, and the fact that you don't have any baggage, you can quickly adjust. And that ability to adapt and pivot is a CEO's strong point. Second off, fundraising and financial management. This is incredibly important. I see people sending out their COO and their CTO to go and fundraise on their behalf. It's a big no-no. The CEO needs to be in charge of both fundraising and understanding the financials of the business. This isn't something that you pawn off to your COO or to your CFO or to an accountant. These are things that you fundamentally need to do and fully understand respectively. Raising capital is extremely difficult. It takes a long time and takes the CEO in order to manage and do properly. Pitching to investors, negotiating fundraising rounds, and maintaining relationships with VCs and angel investors as you grow your business needs to be the primary responsibility of the CEO. It can't be delegated. Everyone can be supportive of this, from both mentors to investors and other shareholders. Everyone within the company can be a part of trying to galvanize investors to support their company, because anybody is allowed to pitch anybody. But ultimately, the CEO needs to be at the head of that ship. It's not something you can delegate, and it's not something that you can hide away from. To be a good CEO, you need to be good at fundraising and knowing your numbers, knowing your books. Ultimately, a CEO is also in charge of monitoring the financial health of their startup. They can do this in conjunction with their CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, or a CRO, their Chief Revenue Officer, if the company has gotten to a stage in which that becomes reasonable to have. They need to oversee the budgeting, the cash flow, and the financial forecasting, understanding that the cash burn that they have is sustainable and is producing to the extent that they'll satisfy the growth targets that your team has set forth. Also, understanding how much runway you have to know how many months you generally have left to continue operating your business. In the early stage of a startup, a lot of times people try to be default alive. That's great for most small to medium-sized businesses, but in some cases, just like if you're playing poker and you know you have a winning hand, you might want to push and go all in. Well, when you're going all in like that, you got to know how many chips you have, right? How much runway, how much longer can you continue to go all in this case, right? And a lot of times, some founders, they're a little bit afraid to push. They're a little bit conservative. Some opportunities may pass them by. So understand where your business comes from as a CEO. That is incredibly important. And ultimately, everyone needs to be on top of the books, understand how the business works from not just their business model, but also how that business model works with an economic model, right? That it fits within the larger macroeconomic environment, that the sales numbers make sense. There's a path to profitability, maybe not in the near term because you're just trying to push, and maybe you're willing to take a little bit of loss in order to grab market share. There's some form of a strategy around it, but knowing that in the future you can flip a lever and raise prices or expand services in order to reach profitability or reduce costs to increase gross margins in order to achieve profitability at some point. These are all the primary roles of a CEO in the financial management side. Being a CEO isn't easy. Another thing that they got to do, team building and recruiting. The best startup CEOs that I've ever seen are constantly trying to recruit and retain top talent. It's not just the 10X engineers, but it's 10X across the board. The best salespeople, the best operations, the best HR, all across the board. Building a strong founding and early team aligned with the startup's mission allows for a startup to do amazing things. Creating a great company culture, shaping and reinforcing the values, work ethic, and communication styles that are necessary for a team to exploit properly a gap in the market. It all starts with the CEO. It permeates down because ultimately everyone on the team should be at some point responsible for recruiting, for team building, for hiring. How a CEO recruits, hires, and unfortunately, in some cases, fires an employee is extremely important. They have to lead by example for the rest of their leadership team and for any future supervisors in the company. And in an early stage founding team with the first few employees, a lot of those employees are going to eventually go on to become supervisors and managers. They're going to be hiring people. The culture that you set, the expectations that you set, the accountability and trust that you have with your employees will ultimately dictate how they keep the rigorous hiring standards that a CEO should be setting and ensure that you have all A players at your company. At some point, a CEO will not be able to have a thumbs up, thumbs down, say, in every single hiring position. But once you emphasize things that are important in the hiring process, then you're going to see the results, that you're going to see employees being hired that fit what you expect in your culture and that are great performers within your company structure. Another thing that falls under the purview of a CEO is setting the product and market focus of the company. You need to understand customer needs while staying deeply involved in identifying target users and validating product market fit. That means having to guide the product direction. You can do this in conjunction with a chief product officer if your company is mature enough to have one, and work closely with your product and engineering teams to ensure the company builds the right solutions. This has to be CEO driven. Doesn't mean that you're directly in the code creating the product, but by having the CEO be deeply involved in customer interviews and usability testing, it allows for the top person within a company to dictate and align everyone in the product, engineering, marketing teams in order to have the right solution and the right messaging going out. One of the core ways that a CEO can interact and influence product and market is to track performance. And I absolutely advocate using KPIs and metrics to measure growth, engagement, and retention. This enables a CEO to delegate certain portions of product and market research, as well as development, to their direct reports, the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, or the CPO, Chief Product Officer. But ultimately, right, the buck stops with the CEO, and so they need to be diligently tracking things. You need to have a strong understanding of what the customer needs are. Ensure that your team is executing on that and understanding that you came up with a hypothesis that this product is going to meet the market needs, and very often the market is going to humble you. It turns out you probably missed the mark here, there, everywhere. I've never really seen someone hit 100% the product perfect right off the bat. There's always going to be something. So it's up to you as a CEO to monitor, to track that, and to be able to make sure that all team members have alignment towards achieving product market fit. CEOs are the public face for their startup. To investors, partners, media, and customers, they are the primary company representative. Whatever the CEO does will reflect either well or poorly for a startup. Aligning internal and external stakeholders will always be a major challenge for a CEO. Communicating clearly with employees, investors, and board members who may or may not have the full information and context within a particular situation is extremely tough. And it's the CEO's job to make sure that everyone is still aligned on the company's mission, to ensure that everyone is working towards accomplishing the company's goals, and ultimately to not get bogged down in so many details and really focus on what each individual stakeholder needs to focus on. Governance and risk management. Boring, but CEOs need to eat their vegetables. This is unfortunately one of those tasks. Ensuring legal and regulatory compliance. The buck stops with the CEO. They are on the hook legally for things. So they need to oversee contracts, equity structures within their company, employee stock options, and corporate governance. Managing risk and identifying potential threats, whether it be financial, operational, or reputational, is incredibly important. And a CEO, a good CEO, will know how to mitigate them effectively. Thankfully, a CEO will have different stakeholders that can help them out. CEOs can work with the board by preparing reports, provide transparency, and seek guidance when needed. Alongside a good legal counsel, governance and risk management, when worked with the board, will ultimately create a smooth, well-run, and legally operating business. The last thing that a CEO needs to think about is accountability. And this isn't just for employees, but for themselves. They are the primary performance driver in their business, translating vision and strategy into execution by properly communicating clear priorities and measurable objectives. Every decision that a CEO makes is important. It's going to affect every part of a company. But there also comes a need to take a step back and understand which ones are high impact decisions. In these decisions, they need to balance short-term needs like survival versus long-term vision like scalability, profitability, scale. A CEO, a good CEO, will evaluate results, continue assessing what's working and what isn't, then iterating quickly. A startup's best tool. So ultimately, these are all the roles and responsibilities. A good CEO will know which one of these they need to take on and which one of these they can delegate. But a CEO at a startup will never be alone. At some point, even with solo founders, you're going to be hiring on leadership. And so let's go through the other positions that a typical startup may have at the beginning and what they may grow into having. I'm primarily going to be focusing on leadership, so let's jump right into the C-suite. Here we can see a diagram that I drew up detailing some of what I think are the most important C-suite employees at a startup. Doesn't mean that every single startup is going to have all of these positions, nor will any startup founding team have all of these positions. But this hopefully will offer a high-level understanding of what potential options you may have in hiring employees that may serve in these leadership roles, for different founders to realize, hey, this is what I'm best at, this is what silo I'm going to be worrying about. And when you scale up and realize that, hey, there's this team that's becoming really big, I need to put leadership there. Maybe sometimes you might have someone who is not yet ready to be a C-suite employee, I've also included a little subscript to some of them about non-C-suite leadership positions, and hopefully that'll help color in some of the gaps. If the CEO sets the vision, then the COO, the Chief Operating Officer, makes it happen. The COO is the engine of execution, building systems, optimizing processes, and ensuring the business runs efficiently day to day. What does that really mean in practice? They're going to be taking the vision and the mission as put forth by the CEO, translating them and working with the CEO to create meaningful goals for the business. What metrics and KPIs need to be tracked for each of the individual team, and can serve as the liaison between the CEO and each individual team's C-suite leadership to ensure that the right people, tools, and workflows are in place to support the day-to-day operation of the business and ultimately growth and scalability. When a CEO needs to ask, what are we doing? Where are we going? The COO should be able to answer. On an early founding team, what I've found is that a COO is typically the quote-unquote second business person. If the CEO is a business-oriented operator, they're going out there doing founder-led sales, fundraising, doing more of the business tasks. Then the CEO, in some cases, operates as the CEO junior, taking on the things that the CEO is unable to do and takes care of some of the delegated tasks there. In cases when a founding team doesn't have that extra business person, then a COO isn't a necessity. At the early stage, there's just work to be done, but there isn't a lot of systems and structure that needs to be put in place for a COO to be operating. At some point, generally post-seed Series A-ish, when you start hiring on a lot of leadership and you start having teams go into their silos, you will need a COO to start instituting a little bit of structure within a business. And so, early stage, probably not necessary to have a COO, but in the cases, again, where we have that second business person, that's generally where I've seen the COO come into effect. Caveat, the one exception is a super labor-intensive business like e-com. The COO is essentially like the floor manager, while the CEO takes care of the back office work, if you will. That's the case where I would see a COO coming into effect, a lot of heavy operations at the beginning with not necessarily siloed teams, but just need to have someone to oversee the day-to-day work. Think the foreman of a construction team. They're in charge on the ground, but you might have the CEO in the office calling, signing contracts, getting that stuff ready. There's just someone that needs to be put in place to manage the day-to-day operations, the execution of the contract, if you will, in that analogy, or in that example. Then I can see a COO being needed right off the get. Moving on, the CTO, or Chief Technology Officer, is the person responsible for building and maintaining the company's technology. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Generally, in an early stage startup, this is your coder. And in the cases where the CEO is technical, this is just the other coder. For an early stage startup, the CTO must be writing code. I don't care. There is no non-technical founding CTOs. They need to be in the code base, designing infrastructure, and shipping product updates. As the company grows, they can move from hands-on engineering into a full leadership role, managing teams, ensuring scalability, security, and technical excellence. But in the early stage, it's all hands on deck, and a CTO can't be sitting back and allowing for others to code on their behalf. They need to be into the technology, or else they haven't earned their title. It's become a more common thing lately for startups to not give a CTO title to the first technical person on a founding team. You'll hear the title founding engineer being given out, and it's generally for younger engineers who aren't ready for a leadership role. I provided in the diagram these non-C-suite titles, generally for these founding engineering type founders and early employees whom you're just not comfortable with giving them a full-on C-suite title because they're likely not ready to jump into that leadership role. They just happen to be there in the beginning to help you code and build a product, but eventually there is going to be someone hired over them. Now, in the cases where you have a founding engineer, they're great, they're growing into a leadership role, but maybe they're needing someone over them. Well, by providing them the title of founding engineer, then eventually making them a VP of engineering, that opens you up to adding someone who will be the CTO to be the boss of the VP of engineering and allow for the upward mobility for that founding engineer if the need arises. And for a CTO, well, they understand that, hey, I'm being hired to take command and I don't have anybody over me in the technology silo. And I understand that the founder is here, but they've been given the position of VP of engineering, so we understand the hierarchy here. So those are the things that, as a CEO, if you're hiring and you're trying to figure out this situation, then this is your kind of playbook to deal with this. That you start someone who may not be ready for a leadership role as a founding engineer. They may or not agree with that. You have the flexibility of a VP of engineering. You could still hire a CTO over them, or if you think they're ready, then fully promote them to CTO. Ultimately, this gives you flexibility and ensure that the technology in your company is in good hands. If the CTO is just coding and building the product, then what's the point of having a chief product officer? Think about it in this way. If the CTO builds the product, then the CPO decides what should be built and why. They are the voice of the customer inside of the company. They are translating the discovered market needs into solutions that drive growth for the startup. They will lead product strategy, design, and user research in order to define what needs to be built, why it matters, and how it should feel for the user. The CPO ensures every product decision ties back to the company's mission and delivers real value to customers. Designers can be founders too, and for those that are not CEOs, this is a natural landing spot for them. Now, I've also included the VP of product there on the screen, also sometimes known as the head of product role. This serves as a good middle ground. If you imagine a junior founding designer being added to a founding team, this allows for a CEO to adequately choose which level of advancement they want to allow their founding designer. Maybe that designer, even though they've worked really hard and it was very important in the early stages of a company, they might not be ready for a leadership role. So you can just leave them as a staff level designer, promote them to a VP of product / head of product role, knowing that you can have a more experienced chief product officer come in and work over them. Given that it's more likely for a startup to have a full engineering team as opposed to a product / design team, you're generally going to see in a lot of startups having a CTO manage their entire engineering staff and then having a VP of product work underneath the CTO. Now, of course, when a company matures, you can have a chief product officer work directly under a CEO, where the CPO essentially creates and manages a full product line and then passes on to a CTO a list of requirements so they can go on and build product in a collaborative manner. So there's going to be some flexibility that's needed within the org chart at some point. But again, providing the VP of product here as a little bit of flexibility when you might have that CTO role, and then putting a chief product officer on the team might be a little bit premature given that you don't have a full design team for them to oversee and manage. In that case, right, having that VP of product underneath a CTO and having them work in a coupled manner with the engineering team works well in the early stage. Then over time, as you grow, you can have that adjustment with a full CPO position. So just laying out all of the different options there. A staple of any B2C company, I generally judge the quality of a consumer startup by how good their CEO or CMO is at marketing. The Chief Marketing Officer leads marketing strategy, brand development, and demand generation. They are the primary storyteller for a startup, responsible for how the world sees and experiences the brand. Their job is to connect with customers through clear messaging, creative campaigns, and data-driven growth strategies. A great CMO turns attention into engagement and then into conversions. Here you can see that I've also included the VP of Marketing position. The reason I put that there is that on our founding team, we might have a marketer that is not ready to take on a full chief executive role. And some of the expectations that come with a chief executive is being able to hire on leadership underneath them, being able to provide strong feedback to their direct report, the CEO, and be able to manage all the functions within their silo, in this case, marketing. And so by adding in this VP of marketing, or some companies might call it head of marketing role, depending on how you want to provide that title, it gives us a little bit more flexibility as a CEO when it comes time to consider promoting people. So in some cases, you might have a really good marketer, part of the founding team, super important in the early stage to help us get going, setting up our social media, building our brand, and ultimately coming up with the messaging that we're going to be providing to not just get our first few customers, but to our 100th, 1,000th, and eventually millionth customer. And so we thank them for their service, and at some point when they're looking for advancement, we can gauge them. Do they have the experience to be a full CMO? Maybe we would have given them that position from the get-go. Maybe they're not ready. But through the course of building the startup with them, you've realized they do have the aptitude for it. So here, let's put them in there. If you don't think that they're ready, and you might consider hiring someone on over them in the future, by making them a VP of marketing, I think it's very reasonable to eventually hire on a more experienced chief marketing officer over that VP of marketing, or by giving them that VP of marketing role, giving yourself, 1 to 2 year runway to eventually promote them into the top job. Transitioning from the CMO now over to the sales side of the house, a staple of B2B companies, the CSO or Chief Sales Officer at a startup generally takes on the responsibility for the entire sales operation and organization from the CEO, and aims to set targets, define territories, and builds and refines the playbook for winning new business. They work closely with the CMO, the CTO, and what we'll be talking about in the future, the CFO, to align strategy and execution, ensuring that every customer conversation drives measurable returns. On screen, you can see the VP of Sales role there, as founder-led sales is an important part of a CEO's job in the early stage of a startup, generally for B2B startups where sales is a heavy focus. You might not need a dedicated chief sales officer, a C-suite person. So the first person that you might hire is to just be an augment to the CEO and basically focus on sales and bring the CEO in as a closer. And so generally that person gets a head of sales slash VP of sales role. They're generally not going to be taking on the full sales apparatus at the start, generally because the CEO or the CEO is going to be handling that. But at some point when the startup gets big enough, you're going to have a chief sales officer to manage that entire silo. And those VP of sales roles then become different regions or different business units. The CFO or Chief Financial Officer manages the budgets, forecast, and cash flows of a startup, guiding the organization's financial health and sustainability. The CFO is the senior executive responsible for managing a company's financial actions, planning, and reporting. In a startup, the CFO oversees accounting, budgeting, cash flow management, and financial forecasting to ensure the business maintains sufficient liquidity and operates efficiently. In essence, the CFO takes some financial matters off of the CEO's plate by providing the crucial financial leadership and analytical insights needed to guide strategic decision-making, support sustainable growth, and maintain the company's fiscal health. Having talked about the marketing, sales, operations, and finance teams, startups have begun using the CRO position to start bringing all of those teams in alignment with each other. Every startup reaches a point where growth can't rely on founder-led sales slash marketing alone. That's where the Chief Revenue Officer steps in. The Chief Revenue Officer, or CRO, builds the framework for consistent, repeatable growth, connecting your sales teams, marketing, customer success, all into one seamless engine. They look beyond quarterly targets and onto the bigger strategic picture and understand how every customer interaction contributes to long-term value. The Chief Communication Officer, or CCO, is the senior executive responsible for managing and directing an organization's internal and external communications. The CCO oversees corporate messaging, media relations, public affairs, crisis communication, and brand reputation to ensure consistency and alignment with the company's mission and strategic goals. This role involves shaping the company's narrative, maintaining relationships with media and stakeholders, and coordinating communications across departments, including marketing, investor relations, and human resources. The CCO ensures all communication, from press releases to internal updates, reinforce the company's identity, values, and long-term objectives. You can see on screen that I've included the head of PR position here. Most startups typically opt for a head of PR rather than a chief communication officer because their communication needs are still tactical, not strategic. In the early stages, the focus is on gaining visibility, handling media outreach, and building brand awareness, tasks that are better suited to a hands-on PR lead or a small agency with someone on your team to manage them. A CCO, by contrast, is a senior strategic role responsible for managing complex corporate messaging, investor relations, and reputations at a large-scale company. Until the startup reaches that stage, with having a large team, multiple stakeholders, and a general public awareness of that company, a head of PR provides the same core functionality without the greater overhead and responsibilities that are needed by a chief communications officer. The Chief Experience Officer, or commonly known as CXO, is the executive responsible for overseeing and optimizing the overall experience of customers and users across all touchpoints with the organization. The CXO ensures that every interaction from marketing and sales to product use and customer support aligns with the company's brand promise and delivers a consistent, high-quality experience. In a startup, the CXO integrates insights from product, design, marketing, and customer success to create seamless and engaging customer journeys that drive satisfaction, loyalty, and long-term retention. The CXO's primary objective is to build an organization that is deeply customer-centric, ensuring that user experience and emotional connection are treated as core business drivers rather than afterthoughts. Underneath the CXO is a team of customer success representatives. They serve as the long-term touchpoints between customers and the startup. Two critical metrics that a CXO will expect their customer success representatives to positively impact are customer retention and net promoter score. Focusing first on customer retention for business models that rely on recurring revenue to work and long-term business relations, then customer success representatives are absolutely crucial in providing the experience that is expected by the CXO to ensure that customers are happy, they have all of their challenges addressed, all of the needs anticipated and brought to the attention of the product team so they can manage that, and to ultimately build trust so that a customer knows that there's someone at the company that they can reliably reach in order to get everything that they need from the product. For the Net Promoter Score side, or NPS, a higher NPS signals stronger relationships and greater word-of-mouth potential, a critical growth driver for startups aiming to expand organically and sustain a positive brand reputation. The last of the major C-suite positions. The Chief Legal Counsel oversees all legal affairs of the company, ensuring that growth and operations occur within a sound and compliant framework. They manage contracts, corporate governance, intellectual property, employment law, and regulatory compliance, providing clear guidance that balances business objectives with legal risk. The Chief Legal Counsel also supports fundraising, investor relations, and strategic partnerships, ensuring that all agreements protect the company's interests and minimize exposure. By working closely with all members of the executive team, they help the organization scale responsibility by safeguarding its assets, reputation, and long-term viability. Their ultimate goal is to enable the startup to move quickly and confidently with legal clarity supporting every major decision. Now, very often, most startups won't have a dedicated legal counsel on their team. They'll have a law firm that they'll occasionally check in to make sure that things are all copacetic. But as the startup gets bigger, a lot more decisions are being made. Having a outside law firm might become a little bit unwieldy, given that the law firm will generally have other clients that they need to focus on. So, when a startup grows enough that every single decision of theirs has some form of legal framework that needs to be worked against and decisions need to be made quickly, that's when you might want to bring in a legal counsel onto your team. And when you start having multiple lawyers on your team, you might have one of them be promoted to the chief legal counsel to manage that and be in the ear of the CEO for many of their major decisions to ensure that everything looks good and is above board, allowing you to also have dispersed amongst the company different legal assets that are available that different C-suite leaders can call upon when they need some of that assistance. Every successful startup is built on more than just a great idea. It's built on its leadership and its team. At the top, the C-suite drives strategy, direction, and accountability. The CEO leads the vision, the COO turns it into execution, the CTO and CPO brings your idea into life, the CMO and CRO continue to drive growth, the CFO protects the foundation, and the CCO, CXO, and Chief Legal Counsel ensures trust, experience, and compliance. But great companies aren't led by executives alone. Beneath the C-suite are key leadership roles that make the engine run. VPs, directors, and heads of critical functions like product, engineering, sales, marketing, people, and operations. These leaders translate big-picture goals into day-to-day execution, bridging the gap between an early-stage idea and eventual business success. As a startup grows, leadership needs to evolve. Responsibilities will shift, delegation is required, new roles emerge, and structure becomes incredibly important. What starts as a small founding team where everybody has to wear 5 different hats gradually becomes a full leadership team, each person focused on scaling their domain. So whether you're building your first company or scaling your next one, remember, Success isn't just about what you build, it's about who builds it with you. Thanks for watching. Until next time.